Okay, welcome all. We are very happy to see you all here today. Bienvenue à toutes et tous. Nous sommes très heureuses de vous revoir toutes et tous. Et bienvenidos, bienvenidas a todos y todas. As you know, on this day, 2 years ago, on May 16, 2020, we published an op-ed, Work, Democratize, Decommodify, Decarbonize, signed by more than 3,000 scholars and published in 43 national media outlets around the globe. The op-ed turned manifesto is available in 27 languages on our website. And since then, a movement and a community has emerged around these ideas, gathering locally and globally to push for change. Building off that work, we wrote the book Democratize Work, the case for reorganizing the economy. And we thrilled for you to join us today to celebrate the book's launch in English. This book is another avenue through which we seek to nurture the conversation on the key tenets on the movement, both within academia and beyond in society in general. As you may know, we gathered for the first ever global forum on democratizing work in October 2021, organizing more than 120 panels with participants from 85 countries and have launched national chapters in 16 countries. Let me now explain how our time today is structured and how you, the audience, can engage with us. In this introduction, Julie and Isabel will give you a very short overview of the content of the book and the authors who wrote chapters in it. Then we will have a 45 minutes high-level panel with 4 fantastic leaders chaired by Professor Sharan. And lastly, in the last half hour, we will have a 30 minutes exchange between the authors and the audience. You can already start to raise questions with the Q&A section only on your right. Please don't use the chat to raise questions, and we will try to address them in that last section. Julie, is you.
Thank you, Dominique. As we gather today on the occasion of our book launch in the United States, let me first say that we are mourning the victims of the horrible racist hate crime committed in Buffalo, New York this weekend, and that we stand in solidarity with all those who are not recognized as equals in dignity and rights, and all those who are fighting to protect and enhance democracies across the globe. Now, as Dominique mentioned, Isabel and I are going to give you a quick overview of the book and the Democratized Work movement. Over the past 2 years, building on our academic work, we have dedicated our efforts to move from agitation to innovation and orchestration. And this has required leveraging the scholarship and expertise of our community. We've also worked with practitioners to build a joint understanding of the practical actions that stem from the Democratizing Work Manifesto and its 3 principles. These key actors include, among others, union leaders, progressive business leaders, climate activists, human rights organizations, progressive political leaders, journalists, youth. Many students are part of this gathering today, and citizens in general. And so today we're particularly excited to be able to contribute to this conversation via the release of our book, Democratize Work, the case for reorganizing the economy, as Dominique mentioned. The book discusses the 3 principles of the manifesto, building on the earlier book, Le Manifeste Travail, that we published in French in October of 2020, and then the Portuguese version of the book that came out in Brazil in March 2021. The English adaptation of the book that is published by the University of Chicago Press is another avenue for which we seek to nurture the conversation on the need to democratize firms, decommodify work, and decarbonize the economy. By choosing to publish our book, the University of Chicago Press is marking its own important milestone. Democratized Work's publication comes exactly 60 years after they published Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, a book that has become one of the intellectual backbones of neoliberalism. So today, we are gathered across physical borders and intellectual boundaries as academics and practitioners to celebrate these new pages. And as we're getting together, our aspiration is to turn the page towards a more just, greener, and fairer economy and society. And so we would like to use this opportunity to also thank our editor, Chad Zimmerman, who's made this whole project possible. Our world is in dire straits. The stakes couldn't be more consequential. We are in the midst of a multidimensional crisis revealed and exacerbated by the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. But it's not merely a health crisis. As we all know, it's also an economic and social crisis characterized by deepening inequalities on the backdrop of a major environmental crisis. The latest IPCC report highlights how this decade, the one coming up, will prove to be a defining one in the history of mankind. So the roadmap we offer in the book, based on all of the co-authors' contribution, is meant to help confront these multiple crises. In the book, we explain how democratizing firms, decommodifying work, and decarbonizing the planet can help us overcome this multidimensional crisis. Now, Isabel, Dominique, and I have not been alone on this journey, far from it. We wish to gratefully recognize the fantastic team of academic leaders who've helped make this work and this movement possible. The scholars, all women, who have formed the core group of our movement and have contributed to this book, represent diverse areas of expertise, as well as diverse national, racial, and linguistic boundaries and backgrounds. It is worth acknowledging the importance of such representation. Across the world, women experts are still often less represented in the public arena. Women's voices are still marginalized, not only in academia, of course, but across the professional spectrum and other spaces of power. And women are still fighting for their basic rights across the globe, and including here in the United States. Now, for all these reasons, centering women's voice was pivotal to this project. And as such, I am delighted to recognize the 10 amazing women scholars who constitute the core group of the Democratizing Work movement and who are the contributors to this book. Alisa Battistoni, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. Adele Blackett, Professor of Law and the Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labor Law and Development at the Faculty of Law at McGill University. Julia Cagé, Associate Professor of Economics at Sciences Po Paris, co-director of the Laboratory for Interdisciplinary Evaluation of Public Policies in Paris, and a research fellow at the London Center for Economic and Policy Research. Neera Shandok, former professor of political science at the University of New Delhi and current distinguished fellow at the Center for Equity Studies in New Delhi. Lisa Herzog, associate professor of political philosophy at Groningen University. Imge Kaya Sabanci, PhD candidate in management and adjunct professor at IE Business School. Sarah Lafuente, researcher at the European Trade Union Institute and the Université Libre de Bruxelles. Hélène Landemort, full professor of political science at Yale University. Flavia Maximo, associate professor of labor law and social security law at the Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto. And Pavlina Chernova, associate professor of economics and director of the Economic Democracy Initiative at Bard College. We must also thank our exceptional translator, Miranda Richmond-Mouillot, who's with us today. Miranda not only translated the book, but helped expertly adapt it to the new context. The English version of the book has a new introduction, revised chapters, and an additional chapter by Alisa Battistoni covering the decarbonizing principle in more depth. Now, Isabel, I'm turning to you. Isabel is going to provide us with a brief overview of the content of the book.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Saludos y saludos a todos y a todas. So now let me tell you a bit more about what's in the book. Given the resonance that the op-ed found, we felt that we had the responsibility to bring together a book that would nurture the understanding and the conversation about these three principles. The three principles are not new. Our societies have seen already many struggles, in fact, that hoped to make them recognized. Labor is not a commodity, sits at the forefront of the preamble of the Declaration of Philadelphia, which was signed at the end of World War II by the members of the International Labour Organization. But we must face it, we have not learned yet. So now, facing potential collapse of catastrophic magnitude, that is the collapse at the climate level as well as the democratic level, we understand that this is the time to recognize these principles, not as separate ideas, but as a tri-dimensional core upon which the survival of all living beings on this planet depend. When we see what is going on today in workplaces in the US, it gives us a measure of hope. There is indeed an unprecedented level of worker organizing in the US right now. Workers at Amazon or Starbucks and at so many places are fighting against the despotism of corporations to ensure the most basic human right at work, that is the right to join a union. This is a fight working people have been fighting for 2 centuries already. So we need to set our eyes further to make sure that not only workers get these basic human rights, but that we guarantee them to be fully recognized as true citizens at work and the economy next to the political realm. So this means that we decommodify labor. That is, that we stop treating workers as tradable commodities, exchange on the so-called labor market. And to do this, we need a publicly funded job guarantee, which will provide all with the right to decent work while meeting the needs of the people and of the planet. To guarantee workers are recognized as true citizens at work means also that we must democratize firms. Workers are the true labor investors without whom these corporations would not operate, as Chris Smalls, the president of the Amazon Labor Union, put it brilliantly last week before the US Senate Committee on the Budget. Workers are actually the only ones who are literally governed by the rule and decisions of the firm, yet they do not bear on its government. Workers risk everything, potentially even their own lives, as we've seen in this pandemic. And unlike shareholders, they do not enjoy the benefit of limited liability. This is unfit for any society, which envisions itself as democratic. Firms are political entities, and quite logically, this means that workers should not only have the right to join a union, but to have their representatives be at least as powerful as the representatives of capital investors currently sitting on boards. As we say in the Democratizing Work op-ed, workers should have the right to collectively validate or veto the decisions of the firm. And finally, to guarantee workers are recognized as true citizens at work means that we put a brake on the economic system that is geared toward extraction. It means corporations, individuals, and our governments take seriously the urgency to decarbonize our lives and have our economy fit within planetary boundaries. This is the third principle. But how can we expect that such a system, which is geared toward extracting value from humans, workers, will start to care so much as to stop extracting value from the planet, which cannot defend itself? We should understand that corporations are extractive by design to generate returns on investment for capital investors. So by decommodifying labor and democratizing firms, we can shift what is valued and redesign how organizations make strategic decisions. Research on hybrid organizations show that this is entirely doable. And doing so will also ensure a much more beneficial relationship between firms and public powers, which is so needed to save the planet and the democratic project. So we hope you will appreciate the book and think it can be useful to many in the various corners of the world, and in particular to your students and the younger generations who definitely will have to take action. So now let us hear from the fantastic leaders gathered today. Let me just first introduce Professor Sharan Bloch, who is going to chair this second part of the webinar. Sharon, for those who don't know her, is the executive director of the Labor and Worklife program. She is just returned to Harvard Law School after having served in the Biden administration. Sharon has been a key ally of the working people and of unions in the US for decades, and I'm really thrilled she can chair this panel. Let me also thank Alida and Jack from Sharon's fantastic team at the Labor and Work-Life program who are powering up this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel and Julie and everybody from around the world joining us today. So first, and especially let me thank also my team here at the Labor and Work-Life program that is helping us make sure everything runs smoothly. So now we're going to have a panel discussion on sort of the import of the book, and I want to introduce our panelists. First, we have Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, member of the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, and former chairperson of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU University in India. Next, we'll hear from Thomas Piketty, Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Economics and author of Capital in the 21st Century and his latest book, A Brief History of Equality, English version published by Harvard University Press, I'm happy to say. Next, we have Nicolás Grau, Minister of Economy, Development, and Tourism of Chile since March 2022. And finally, we will be joined by Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation and former president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. I want to let my panelists know we have so much to pack into this conversation. I am going to be keeping time. I'll raise my hand when you have about 30 seconds left for your answer. This will allow us to get through everybody on all the questions. So let's start with your key takeaways from the book. Why does this book matter? And I'll turn to Jayati first.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here with this fabulous group of authors and these fabulous panelists as well. So let me just highlight, I basically have 5 important takeaways, I think, from this book. And the first came out a little bit already from what Isabel was saying, which is that everything is interconnected. You cannot do one without necessarily doing the other. Protecting labor also means protecting the planet. Equal voices at work also means equal dignity for all citizens. Decommodifying work, and here I think it's really good the book has gone beyond the manifesto, which had to be short. Decommodifying work goes beyond the workplace as defined in terms of organized enterprises into ensuring the dignity of informal and unpaid workers, addressing the coloniality of labor laws and labor relations. I think these are all very important contributions. So that's the first big takeaway for me. The second is it's a very powerful phrase that I think Isabel used in her contribution. It's the immense subversive power of work. She says it's enough to change the world and to reduce what has been called epistemic injustice. I think Lisa Herzog uses that term. That work is, because it effectively is the fundamental condition of human life, whether it's recognized or not, whether it is paid, formal, informal, the nature of the workplace is so critically determining of human life that our ability to change those conditions in turn has a massive, in a sense, revolutionary potential of changing how we live our lives. And third, of course, it's very practical. It tells you how you can begin going about these things. It's not just thinking in this grand terms, but it's also suggesting clear pathways, a universal job guarantee, universal social protection clause, universal provision of the basic needs and necessities of life, and simultaneously undoing the power hierarchies in workplaces through institutional reforms and through the appropriate kinds of legislation and strategies as well. I think the fourth message that came out to me very, very clearly was that, you have to join hands to work through this. You have to have all kinds of coalitions. You can't just do it on your own. We can't just do it in a small group, a small band of people who feel exactly the same, but we have to have much broader coalitions. And I think Adele Blackett's contribution here was really useful because not only does she stress the importance of dignity, but also how we have to sort of live and work through critiques, discomfort, and even backlash. We have to be able to recognize all of these things, and we have to be able to deal with them, and we have to be able to generate coalitions that can work. And finally, a message for me, which was not really explicit in the book, but it underlies everything, is the extreme urgency of this task. It's really something you can't postpone. You can't say we will do this slowly over time. I mean, everybody talks about how climate change is already upon us and all these other catastrophes are already upon us. It's not just that. It is that these changes, really, we have to get going in terms of thinking of transformative strategies and policies immediately. And I think that's a very important message also, which is implicit in this book. But let me stop here. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that last point about urgency is something that we all do feel. Let me turn next to Thomas. Can you please share with us, and good to see you again, share with us your key takeaways from the book?
Yeah, I think there's really something quite unique about this manifesto and book, both because, it involves so many scholars, and also because, the art of the proposal is, first to connect the issue of the democratization of work, decommodification of the economy, decarbonization of economy, and in particular to put the emphasis on, right in the title, on the democratization of work. And I think, here there's something really new, as compared to the sort of traditional sort of state-centered approach on transforming the economy through nationalization policy, which, of course, can be very important in certain sectors, but the emphasis that this manifesto is putting on this participatory approach and this democratization of work and a better distribution of power in companies and the issue of economic democracy, I think is really new and extremely important. And let me stress maybe the one message I want to put in this short intervention is let's be optimistic. I think, of course it's hard sometimes to be optimistic, but let me stress that this is a battle that can be won, and that in the past, we've seen, I've tried to emphasize in my latest book that we've seen a long-run movement toward more equality, in spite of a lot of setbacks, of course, and a lot of progress that remains to be made. But in particular, in this specific area on democratizing work, we've seen in history examples of countries like Germany, Sweden, which have introduced more rights for workers, including seats in boards of corporations and other countries. This is still not enough. This is very much insufficient. But not only this did not create a disaster in the economy, as traditional advocates of shareholder power will say, but in fact it was very successful historically, and it allowed to involve workers in the defining the long-run strategy of their company. And I can tell you, in my country, in France, for a long time shareholders have been very conservative, and they're still very conservative, basically basically saying, okay, we don't want to see workers, in the board of corporation. We don't want to see them in our books. We don't want to open our books. Workers should just demonstrate in the street and shout and cry and claim, but we don't want to give them any power. This would be a catastrophe for the economy. And in the past 10 to 15 years, people have started to tell employers and shareholders in France, well, look, this is what we've had in Germany or Sweden for many decades, and it doesn't seem to be such a catastrophe. But let me stress that the very fact, like what we have in Sweden and Germany, that in large corporations you have up to 50% of the seats in boards of large companies going to worker representative. This is not enough because shareholders still have 50% plus one, but it means that if in addition workers or local government, as it happens sometimes, have a 10% or 20% stake in the capital of the company, then you can shift the majority even in front of a shareholder who has 80 or 90% of the capital. And from the point of view of a shareholder, this is almost communism. This is something that's unbearable. Well, not only it works, but I think, the lesson from history and from many of the analyses proposed in this book is that we could go further than this. I think we could have, at least 50% of voting rights for workers representative in board of companies. And in addition, in the 50% of voting rights that will remain with shareholders, you could have a cap, say, not more than 10% of voting rights for an individual shareholder in a large company. Because you cannot let one individual decide on its own or on her own, such complicated decision with huge impact on very large communities. And at some point, especially as the company gets bigger, you need to talk. You need to have a deliberation. You need to involve more people in the decision-making process. So just to summarize, there are many other ways to better distribute power in companies. Isabel in particular has been stressing, the importance of having this sort of bicameral system with, in effect, veto power for worker representatives. That's also very interesting. But, in any case, we need to move ahead, and I think this book can really be a landmark in this direction. So congratulations to all authors.
Thank you so much. Really important point to show we have things that are working, which gives us confidence that we can go even further, as the book suggests. So next, let's turn to Nicolás to share your takeaways.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, thanks for, first, thanks for the invitation to Isabel, and congratulations to the authors of this book. It's a really interesting one, and I think it's quite relevant for our moment. So let me first say that I share the relevance of the agenda. About the book, I also like the format, meaning a main text, which is the manifesto, and then a lot of discussion and about that main idea. So I think it's a very useful book for discussing in classes and so on. Now I'm a Minister of Economy. I used to be a teacher, so now I am in a different situation. But as a former professor, I could say that it could be really useful for a class to discuss. And I also think that the COVID situation is an opportunity to rethink some aspect of our social contract, which is the context of this book. Here I'm thinking in something that Professor Piketty stresses in his book, that when you see big transformations in let's say in the 20th century, you're going to see that this is the combination of some political and historical situation, for example, finishing some war, as the one that we have due to the COVID right now, a combination of that with some development of some ideas. Okay, so I think the book is that. The book is trying to putting together the ideas of democratizing the firm, trying to take advantage of the political and historical situation that we have now. So basically, there are some ideas that are waiting their opportunity. This is an opportunity, and the book is trying to put together and take advantage of the political situation. So I think it's a good timing for the book. In the case of Chile, in particular, I think this health and economic crisis, together with the social and political conflict that we had just before the COVID in 2019, which maybe you know that lead to a very important agreement to have a democratic process to discuss our constitution, a constitution that is coming from the dictatorship. So it's a big opportunity to Chile to have a democratic basis for our constitution. I think that situation will allow us, in the case of Chile, I hope, to make important progress in building what you can call the welfare state, let's say. So this is the Chilean situation is less progressive than the situation that is promoted in this book, but I think it's related with the contents of the book in many different aspects. Yeah. I would say two more things about the contents of the book. First, I am optimistic about the agenda of this book, not just because of the political situation, but also because of the wave of 30 or 40 years that we have of neoliberalism. I think that approach didn't work, even what they promise. Okay. So I think, and if you put that together with the COVID situation, with the situation that we have in 2008, given the financial crisis and so on, I think there is going to be an opportunity for the next, let's say, 50 years to make progress in this agenda, in ways that maybe they are going to depend on the specific characteristic of each country. As I was saying before, it is different, this agenda in the context of Europe, okay, versus the context of the South, okay, where the situation that we have is not as good in terms of, let's say, some social rights, or, for example, the possibility that workers have to bargain their salary, for example, which is a more traditional approach to give power to the workers. Okay. That said, and this is the only point that I have, let's say, a not that optimistic view as the one that is expressed in the book. I think that the relationship between the ecological agenda and the progress in democracy in firms is more problematic, I would say. And this is given my experience this 2 months in the office, and also before. And to me, this relationship depends on what is the nature of the economic externality that is trying to be addressed. When the economic externality has a local impact, for example, pollution, I think that the relationship is more direct. Okay? Because in that case, as you say in the book, the workers live in the community, so they are going to suffer that externality. They internalize that externality, and since they have voice in the firm, they are going to push for, let's say, changing the technology. Okay? But when you talk about decarbonization, it's different. Because in that case, this is something that you do not, the impact of that firm is not relevant in terms of the local impact, but it's relevant in terms of the global impact and how they add more problems to the world. Okay? And in that case, I think basically the only way to address them is having discussions about having discussion about the parliament, the state, and so on, because you need to address this big problem. Actually, you need to address this problem discussing and having coordination among different countries. Okay? So in that case, I think the relationship between democracy in the firm and the ecological agenda is not that clear as the one that you have, for example, in the case of pollution. So I'm going to stop there, but again, thanks for the invitation. It's a really interesting book, and I suggest that all people read this book.
Thank you. Thanks for injecting a note of both optimism and maybe some caution. And now I want to turn to Sharan Burrows. And Sharon, thank you so much for joining us. We know you are in the midst of some very important negotiations, and so we really appreciate you making the time to share your takeaways from the book. What's the most important ideas that come up for you? And we're asking in this initial round for folks to keep their comments to 5 minutes. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And thank you for asking me. There is nothing more important than, of course, involvement of workers at their workplace in the work that they are doing. It's not just about the dignity of work. It's also about the productivity and the creativity that is generated from engagement with workers who actually understand the nature of the tasks that they are engaged in. I've been through a number of, it probably shows my age, but iterations of similar discussions. We actually went through, of course, the workplace democracy movement in the 70s and 80s, the high performance workplaces, the revolution around workplace organization and skilling of workers. And of course, then we've seen the disasters of since the 80s of the breakdown in the social contract with, in fact, the explosion of globalization to the point where our supply chain workplaces have largely been based on dehumanizing exploitation, where the lessons indeed of building sustainable businesses, both for people and indeed and I referenced one of the previous speakers, the planet, absolutely has to be hand in hand, and yet we forgot the lessons of this. Now we're in an era where we're talking about climate proofing our workplaces. We have our own workplace agenda, we call it Kapow, inviting workers to be trained about how to engage with each other and their employers in climate and employment proofing workplaces, because we see people and the planet as being indeed inseparable in terms of trying to generate a sustainable and an inclusive future. But we also are in a moment where we hope that we will see the fruits of a campaign to have occupational health and safety actually made a fundamental right at work. Don't think I have to convince anyone here, even pre-COVID, but certainly through the pandemic, that health and safety indeed had to be raised to the level of a priority. But if we get the endorsement of the ILO conference, then in fact we will see this not just as a fundamental right, but it allows us to build some of the best of workplace democracy and social dialogue around joint committees, health and safety committees, where workers are indeed protecting themselves and their colleagues, but also making sure that with the employers, there is an environment that's both healthy in many ways across mental and physical health, but also it's a productive environment. So I could talk to you about a lot of initiatives, but can I just say, if we don't actually use the notion of democracy, if we don't pick up some of the very rich ideas in this publication and go back to having the conversations about what makes for the dignity of work, then we will just see the increased supply chain model where labour is indeed a commodity, and we know that it stands in opposition totally to the international rule of law, beginning with the ILO Constitution. So thank you and congratulations, and it's a great read.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the lifting up the importance of safety and health as a fundamental issue on its own, but also as an organizing principle. But learn some lessons that you have to learn to do it right. And that's clearly not something that here in the US we've quite accomplished yet. Okay, we're going to move to our second round of questions. I'm going to ask our panelists to keep responses really, really short, just 2 minutes. Really think of these as planting seeds for the audience. I'm going to ask you to think about the book as a tool. So what do we do with this tool? What's next for the Democratizing Work manifesto that has really turned into this movement? What is one or two concrete actions that you are taking or that you would recommend to our audience to think about taking? And again, super quick, plant those seeds. And I'll go back to Jayati first.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And I think the first tool is out there in the book, explicit. It's in the manifesto as well, the significance of a job guarantee. I think it's absolutely huge. It has so much potential in so many different ways, particularly in countries like in many developing countries where so much of the work is informal and it's hard to regulate in typical ways. And it's hard to even conceive of workplaces that need to be democratized. So a universal job guarantee, absolutely essential out there. I think the other importance is the power of association, the power of unionizing, of getting people together. And I would add or extend that to the power of coalitions, really, to also push for legislative changes that can make a difference in many different ways.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, let's go back to Thomas.
Yeah, well, there are so many proposals that are very important. The job guarantee, certainly, the better sharing of power in general in societies, in particular in companies. Let me maybe stress also, what's said in the book about the media and the transformation of the media. I think the concentration of power is a problem in every sector, obviously, but in the media, it's even more problematic. And the fact that one single individual, because he owns $200 billion, can say, okay, I'm going to buy Twitter, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do about it. This is crazy. And the fact that the US government and the EU government of don't really take seriously these issues and don't act as much as they should about this, I think is a big problem. And so that's one direction in which we all need to mobilize around concrete proposal to take back control of the media and of the democratic process more generally.
Great, thank you. Really important issues, obviously. Okay, Nicolás, let's turn back to you. What action do you want to inspire in others or in yourself?
Well, I'm going to say something very concrete, maybe small, but I think this is a book that is so useful for having, let's say, reading groups about how to think about this issue. And also, I would say that it could be useful to, since the book is a very good justification about this agenda. Then maybe the next step is to discuss how to make progress of this agenda in each specific country, basically, and thinking how the debate that is in the book is a useful roadmap for that for that discussion. So I would say that read the book, make these reading groups to analyze what is in the book, and then thinking how to make progress in each specific context about the agenda that is proposed by the book.
Great, thank you. I know that I will be using the book in my course in the fall, so really looking forward to hearing what the students think of it. And next, Sharon, I'll turn to you.
So I want to support Jayati, because if we don't return to full employment, and if we don't have a jobs guarantee, then you don't actually really start with the dignity of decent work. And we know that this works for people, it works for the economy, and it works indeed to guarantee the heart of what we call the social contract, which is in fact jobs, climate-friendly jobs, obviously, with just transition, but rights and social protection. But I'd add to the job guarantee social dialogue. If in fact you aren't able to be present at the tables for both the transition of climate and of technology, if you're not at the design table negotiating the agreements about the nature of the work, then really democracy is a missing concept in our workplaces. So definitely a jobs guarantee, return to full employment, and social dialogue as the means by which people shape in a co-generation way the future.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to turn to our panel one more time for another round of short 2-minute answers. But before we do that, I do want to remind the audience that we will be moving after the panel to a more open conversation with the authors, with the authors who were introduced at the beginning of the program. So please put your questions for the authors in the Q&A function. And we're looking forward to a very rich conversation during this last half hour, this third part of the program. Okay, so our last question, I know this is just feels like it's gone so fast, but just want to turn to our panelists and give you an opportunity for a last thought about the book that you haven't had a chance to raise yet, or a reaction to something that one of your co-panelists raised. And let's flip the order this time. So Sharon, I'm going to turn to you first if you've got a last reaction or a final thought.
Well, I really love the idea that you're going to use it with your students, because I actually think that we've got to start by rethinking what it is that the world of work requires in order to repair, reframe, recreate the labour market. When you've got more than 60% of the world's workers now working informally, no rights, no minimum wage, no social protection, no rule of law, that's that dehumanising exploitation. And it certainly is true that labour is a commodity. So we know labour movement that I represent will fight for the legislation, will fight for the mandated due diligence, will fight for the rights that workers need and just wages. But if in fact you can infiltrate the design thinking of those young minds who will shape the future, whether as entrepreneurs, managers, or indeed workers, that's fantastic.
Great, thank you. Nicolás, let's turn to you now.
Yeah, well, first, thanks again for inviting me to present, to discussing this book. Maybe one last thought is about the relationship of the proposal of the book with the experience of co-determination in Europe. I think that relationship could be more developed in future research, since there has been some debates in economics, at least, about the impact of this experience. And since I am quite optimistic about this agenda, and I think it's so important, mainly because of the intrinsic justification of the agenda. But since let's say the instrumental justification of the agenda has been debated, I think it would be nice to have more discussion about these two types of justification and how they can reinforce each other.
Great. I'm going to cling to your optimism because I'm finding this a tough time to be optimistic. So thank you for injecting that. Thomas, let's hear your final thoughts.
Well, let me simply say that, the redistribution of power and on the one hand, and the redistribution of income and wealth on the other hand, really have to come together. They are intimately related. So when you transform the system of voting rights and corporation, you also want at the same time to redistribute properties through progressive taxation, minimum inheritance, and all of this transformation, will require enormous social and political mobilization, in some cases constitutional changes, because constitutions were often written a long time ago by property owners in order to prevent these changes from happening. And you know, I want you know, to give a final you know, applaud to what has been happening in Chile and to Nicolás. And you know, I think this, you know, this is a very complicated process, obviously, but we should all be aware, you know, everywhere, that, you know, ultimately these are really deep changes in the legal order, the legal system, and the social mobilization process that are necessary to go in this direction. The good news is that this is what has happened many times in the past. This is what has happened in the long run, and this movement toward more equality, you know, started centuries ago, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. And you know, again, this book is really a very useful step in this direction.
Great, thank you. And I will note that my students will also be reading a little bit of A Brief History of Equality in the fall too, yeah. Another important text. So Jayati, I want to give you the last word on this panel.
Well, thank you. And you know, it's lovely to be in so much optimism. It's a really good feeling. As you said, it's not been a very optimistic time in many other ways, but when you look at the long run of things, yes, I think there is good reason to be optimistic, despite immediate pitfalls and potential calamities in the way. So just 2 points. One, I just want to reiterate Thomas' point about the media and how critical that is, and how difficult it is actually to ensure and democratize the media now. But it has to be one of our priorities, in fact, is to make sure that the media are free and democratic and do present the needs and realities of people and citizens in general. And the second is just to throw in another thing in there, which is kind of implicit in some of the articles in the book, but really I think needs a bit more spelling out, which is the importance of workers who are not recognized as workers, the unpaid work. I know Sharon is very aware of this, but you know, we really have to bring them on very much front and center also in any discussion of democratizing work.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the panel, all our panelists. This really was a great taste of what is a really fascinating book, and I'm sure spurring many important conversations among our audience. So thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time. Okay, now we're going to move to the third part of the program, where we are going to open up the conversation between the audience and our authors, who have also been so generous with their time. And so I am going to turn this part of the program over to Adele Blackett, Professor of Law at McGill University, who's going to chair this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much. What a wonderful plenary to just have had. Seiko, hola, encantada ver tantas gente de diferentes partes del mundo participando hoy. Bonjour, je suis ravie de cet engagement profond avec les questions qui sont parmi nous. I have the honor of joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Kanakahaga Nation in what is also known as Montreal. And it is an honor to be part of this celebration and a part of this deliberately plural team of women who have authored this book. And I'm grateful that we began both with an acknowledgement of the weight of this moment. Thank you, Julie, for mentioning in particular the Buffalo Massacre and the depth of the engagement with the intertwined nature of systems of oppression and the need to work through each and all. And so, Jayati, thank you for starting with the interconnected character of the issues and the way that that is underscored in this work. There are a lot of questions that have emerged through this discussion, and I'm anxious to get directly to them and to ensure that we can work through them and hear from the many authors who are gathered here today. But just let me take this moment to stress how much this is an ongoing process. And so a source of tremendous delight for me actually was to hear that this book will be the basis for ongoing movements and part of classes and part of study sessions, right? This book is meant to be part of a movement. And so the first question that I actually think I'll direct to Pavlina is concerning work, the extent to which it's changed, the nature of the online platforms and marketplaces, and the query that we might no longer have employers, but just a proliferation of workers. And the question becomes, how can democracy work in such organizations which appear as the main work organizers of the future? May I say that this question may dovetail to some extent with concerns around informal economy work. And so how do we address that? And I note an engagement as well with the risk that some of this perceived loss of an employment relationship is actually disguised employment. So Pavlina, would you like to take a first opportunity to respond to this concern?
Thank you, Adele. Yes, happy to. And thank you so much to the panelists for your interventions. I think that the main starting proposition for all of us and for our work is that our concerns are intertwined and that in fact our fates are not separate. Those who are in formal employment, those who are in informal employment, those who are in unrecognized employment, and those who don't have employment whatsoever. But also that our fates as people and how we self-determine, and that the labor, the conditions of work, not necessarily the labor relationship, but the condition of work, which is we understand as a process of participation and a process of care, and that process, that social process of work, is one of existential concern. How people are supported, how they're able to self-determine, how we care for our loved ones, including the planet on which we live on. And so I think that this is the broad framework within which we understand the meaning of democratizing work. And so to connect your question with Nicolás's concern, I really appreciate the comments, because our work is certainly just at the beginning, and there are so many linkages that we need to flesh out and articulate. And part of this movement is getting people on board to help us do that. But when we argue that we want to decommodify work, that once again speaks to the broader human concern that our labor should not be narrowly linked to the profitability from our labor. And then that recognition is critical in how we organize the workplace. So the decommodify component is inherently connected to the democratize component of our work, that we want to be able to empower the labor investors, those who put their efforts into care, to be able to have decision-making power and to be able to govern themselves in all forms of work, private sector work, public sector work, informal sector work. So when you consider, for example, the contribution of the job guarantee to the broader project, it says we will recognize previously unrecognized forms of labor, and we will support them with what we believe is the minimum necessary pay and benefit conditions that we as society collectively determine. And if that does mean cooperative arrangements where people are, organized in job employment projects that serve the social concern, but they have different forms of organization and employment relationships, then that is something that we would like to support. So decommodifying work has to do with the workplace government, the government of the workplace, but it also has to do with the fact that we shouldn't see people as casualties of an economy that is constantly unstable, that sees technology not as a threat, not as a friend, but as a threat, that sees various forces of globalization that sacrifice employment as threatening. So we want to sort of get rid of that neglect that comes through the labor market and institute or implement institutions that support working people. And that neglect then transfers to the neglect of the planet. I think in our conception, the fates of people are not independent from the fates of the planet. And what good is it to create great working environment and working conditions if we do not also take care of the home that we have here? And so the connection between democratizing work and the decarbonizing principle we see as inherent, because every policy that deals with decarbonization is a social policy and an economic policy and a policy that impacts who does the work, how the work is done, where it is done, who it benefits. And so to this end, our fates and our work is intertwined. I hope that was a start of an answer.
That was a pretty comprehensive answer, if I do say so myself, really thoughtful. And I wonder whether, Isabel, you might want to jump in on this as well. You might be muted. Yes, okay.
I would be happy to let the other authors speak, actually, because I feel like I've spoken already, and I think there are so many key questions. But just to say one line, yes, I think it's really key to take stock of the fact that we have these three principles as core, and that indeed the democratization of firm will not be enough to decarbonize the planet. We need both principles at the same time to decarbonize firms and decommodify labor. And by doing so and moving forward with the two principles, we can indeed provide a serious answer to the third one. But I understand the minister concern if we only look at democratization.
That's lovely. Thank you very much for that. And I had interjected a bit of a focus on informality, and I wonder whether Neera might be interested in stepping in to address that dimension. Is the interconnection woven through a close attention to the prevalence of informality in many parts of the world, but also in the global South?
Yes, thank you, Adele. I'm afraid that trade unions in Europe and perhaps the United States do not adequately represent the fact that much of the low-paying and high-risk jobs are farmed out to workers in the informal sector in the global South. Now, these workers work in very hazardous conditions. In fact, today is a very grief-ridden day for me. 27 women have died because they were working in a CCTV camera factory, which was illegal in the outskirts of Delhi. The fire broke out, 27 of them died. They only been able to recover 8 bodies, and they can't identify their charred beyond recognition. So this was a kind of work that is being done in the informal sector. And I wish that the big companies for whom they are performing this kind of work would represent their interest in global forums. So the link between informal workers in the global South and formal trade unions in advanced capitalist countries needs to be strengthened. Otherwise, this whole notion of a coalition of workers is not going to really have any benefit for people who are given salaries much below the poverty line in most of these countries. And it's not only India, it's all over. Bangladesh, which produces textiles, women are regularly charged to death because they are working in terrible conditions, no ventilation, and they're just churning out textiles. And it happens in Pakistan, it happens in the Arab world. So unless the formal trade unions take up this issue of linkages between formal and informal workers, I don't think our task of democratizing work is going to really move ahead very meaningfully for at least large sections.
Thank you for that that provocation. It's critical, and I see in the question and answer a number of questions that actually go right to the issue of compatibility with our current economic system and to capitalism, and perhaps to thinking of capitalism as one variety alone. But I wonder if there are members of our authors collective who might want to intervene, and I'm inclined to turn to Flavia. Would you want to address some of these themes and how they relate to the intertwined character of democratizing, decommodifying, and decarbonizing work?
Thank you, Adele. Can you hear me well?
Perfectly, yes.
Yes. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm seeing a lot of questions regarding the compatibility of democratizing firms and capitalism, and also questions about indigenous people and the relationship between race and democratizing firms. So I think the good thing about our book is that we deal in a certain level with geopolitics of knowledge. So we know that these three principles, they're not going to be applying the same way depending on the territory. So alongside with democratizing firms, and alongside with also decommodifying work and decarbonizing the environment, the planet, we have to think about, as Nehru said, that these principles, they are not applied just to the employment relationship. So we have to create links to with the global South and the informal economy. So I think one of the questions here were the roles of the cooperatives. Cooperatives at work are like extremely important in the global South as a counter movement to against capitalism and this hegemonic voice. This is also applied to the question about democratic design. We need to create bridges to hear those people's voice and to put this in my case, in labor law. So how can we do this? Like in the global South, we have like a pretty good experience with cooperatives, with waste pickers. They are informal workers, and they are like helping to decarbonize the environment in the Northeast in Brazil. We have also informal economy cooperatives with women, not only in Brazil, but also I know in India. They're very, very important to this link between the three principles, but also important to collective agreements, because these informal cooperatives in India and in Brazil, they also have voice to put in collective is to discuss labor epistemology. We will never democratize labor if we don't put together all these principles with decolonizing knowledge production. So I think we also have to think about what we want for the future in terms of concepts. They are central to justice, like the concept of labor, the concept of value, and how the concept of time, and how these concepts, they related to race and gender. So I think, I don't know, I think these are the main links here between all those questions.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Thank you. A really thoughtful engagement with a number of the questions, including the questions on alternative structures, and perhaps keeping along that line, but turning to a series of questions that perhaps, Sarah, you might want to address that focus on the role of unions and in relation to the behavior of CEOs on particular tension. There's one question on Sweden and unions as well. Sarah, how would you approach these questions and where unions' role may be better understood, better directed to address some of the challenges that underlie our book?
Thank you very much, Adele. And thank you to all the participants and panelists, of course. Well, I was seeing also this series of questions related to the role of unions, and this is indeed a very tricky question. It has taken decades and a whole century for the union movement itself to develop and discuss about ideas of participation, co-determination, industrial democracy. So I mean, we could spend a lot of time discussing only these particular issues, but a couple of ideas perhaps. So on the, well, on the aspect, the question that was asked related to Sweden, but also to the German system of co-determination, right? And how the book provided, or what we proposed as to develop these models, or to challenge to propose what would be the role of unions in democratizing firms. We could say, well, there are of course very different ways of understanding democratizing firms, and the idea that was developed in Europe and that and where unions could be more involved was indirect participation, right? Yeah, in the book, the proposal suggests to develop a bit more co-determination. So going beyond the co-determination model that we know from Germany, and going beyond the information and consultation rights that were most developed in Works Council, but that also limit a lot the collective voice of workers. And we can see representatives, at least in European companies. So here we're not talking about informal work, but actual very formalized work. But we still realize how worker representatives and unions are often very frustrated with the fact that information and consultation is not enough, is not sufficient to actually make them actually influence decision making in the company. So the proposal of the bicameral model that the book suggests, and this is a way of stimulating debate as well within unions, is to bring basically the collective voice of workers at the same level as the voice of shareholders, of course, in the capitalist system. The unions should, and this is something we address in the book, should definitely have a role in there, not only or most importantly, to ensure that solidarity can be created across the industry. So this model shouldn't recreate corporatists or bring corporations and corporatist interest of workers against each other, but actually ensure and secure that solidarity can be maintained across workers within a sector, within a nation, and even at an international level. So this solidarity aspect is really really important. On the CEOs, perhaps the aspect and the question of what does the book propose as an incentive to CEOs? Well, the idea, what the book suggests, is actually it brings together, or it puts together in a kind of accessible format what is actually happening and we are seeing occurring in the world of work recently. And I think basically what the reality shows us in the US, the whole unionization in Starbucks, Amazon, and platform work more generally, is that basically collective action won't stop as long as capitalism exists, right? Workers will need to organize collectively. And we see these examples happening in these different contexts. So I think giving and promoting ideas, institutions to give workers this collective voice is definitely a way, and also a proposal that CEOs would be hearing for, because otherwise collective action by workers won't stop anyway. So, well, these were my my two inputs. I don't know if Isabel perhaps wants to add something on that part.
So thank you very much, Sarah. What a thoughtful reflection, underscoring collective voice, indirect participation, and the power in solidarity. And perhaps I might suggest, given her recent co-authored publication on Power for All, if Julie might want to step in and add in relation to this theme.
Thank you, Adele, and thank you, Sarah. Just want to complement what Sarah said. I think that what's at stake really today, especially if you think about the world of corporations, is power sharing on the one hand, which is absolutely critical. And then there's also holding those in power accountable within corporations. So if we think about power sharing, we have to be thinking about sharing power across demographic groups, think about gender, equality, think about racial equality, all absolutely critical issues we have to pay attention to. And that goes hand in hand with power sharing between shareholders, top executives, and workers, employees. And that's what democratizing work is about. I want to talk a little bit more about accountability because it's connected to democratizing. The question is, what are we holding companies accountable for? And there are many people today in companies, including some of the leaders of these companies and many of the employees who want companies to evolve. They want their companies to become more sustainable. They care about financial performance and they care about social and environmental performance. And so this is why I think what's critical is that we think about the redesign of the institutional system. And this is where we, citizens, voters have a role to play and public authorities have a role to play. We need to hold companies accountable not only for their financial performance, but also for their social and environmental performance. And we, among the group of co-authors, have been contacted by a number of organizations, standard setters, organizations like B-Lab, that have been in touch to sort of work with us on critical issues related to, now, what does it mean to democratize work and what are the implications as we think about holding companies accountable and also helping companies, helping the leadership, helping the employees operate the transition. Because again, a lot of them want to make these things happen, but it's not easy to make them happen in an environment that is still not designed to support the pursuit of these multiple objectives.
Thank you so much for that. And your comment offers a really helpful segue back into, frankly, an early question regarding the role of the European Union and the ways in which, or the interplay between regulatory initiatives, directives that might, for example, address social responsibility and the initiatives that then happen in respect of social dialogue, to recall Sharon Burrow's framing through the ILO of this notion. And I wonder, Imge, would you be interested in turning your attention to the EU role in relation to this work? Not a small topic, but a dimension of that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adele. I'll try to keep it short to be able to listen to everyone, because I second all the very well thought points of all the colleagues. So if you look at it from a policy making perspective, because we take this question a lot, so what should we demand from the policymakers, or how, like the question of we have here from the EU play the role at democracy at work. So I think that like the democracy at work can only be ensured once the majority of the actors respect and support democratic principles and the exercise of democratic rights. So in this regard, at very minimum, EU and all national legislators should agree that European law does not circumvent the participation rights of workers. And to add this from another point, like we talked about inequalities and the gender, and I also touched upon the gender issues in my part from a policymaking perspective. And I would suggest being bold in enforcing gender quotas as well. So we need to take some concrete steps to tackle inequalities and the intricacies associated with them. And if the market fails to ensure equal representation of workers, equal representation of gender, equal representation of races, any equal representation on its own, then the government should not shy away from taking proactive measures like quotas. So that's what I would like to add at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Very clear, very bold, and helpful articulation. There are some questions, well, one in particular that focused on particular category of workers, and how could we not focus on healthcare workers in a work that emerges out of the pandemic, right? And in its deep impact, and so many of the issues articulated in the book dovetail with healthcare workers. And so the question is, how do we as healthcare workers democratize our workplaces, the hospitals and the NHS? So I gather this question is coming from the UK or other public health systems in other countries. Our personal commitment to our patients has historically and currently made it easier for this skilled labor force to be exploited and commodified, where productivity is prioritized over patient safety, quality, and training, with diminishing power of the expert health worker to influence this. And I've read this question out as a whole because I think it so compellingly frames the challenges, and something to which, frankly, in our last conference, Jayati Ghosh spoke to as well. So how do we think about care? How do we think about this work, and where we should be looking at something so essential? And so I'm inclined to turn this over to Alyssa to address. Alyssa?
Yes, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. It's been a fabulous panel so far. And I think it's a really great and important question. One that has been a challenge. I think the question really raises one of the tensions and challenges of organizing care workers, but also many other kinds of workers who are sort of in direct, in sort of a direct relationship with the people they're providing some kind of necessary service to. We see this often with also with teachers, often, and sort of the challenges that teachers have in organizing and sort of around their labor. And I one thing that I've found, so I both do think that in many ways the decommodifying principle is really important for this. And I know the questioner is asking about the NHS and the pressures being put on the NHS, which is already a decommodified healthcare system. But I do think we can see, in comparison to, for example, the US, where I am, and where obviously we don't have a decommodified healthcare system, those pressures are much more intense. They do result in both very bad working conditions, and quite often, those are also the poor conditions for patients and for staff at the same time. And so I think one of the things that's been inspiring to me, at least, is seeing in labor organizing, making exactly the connection that you described, right? And saying our working conditions are your, teachers unions will say our students' learning conditions. In the case of care, it might say our working conditions are, the conditions of care for our patients, for, for elder care, for whatever kind of care it is, that if you have, that in fact those standards can rise or fall together, and seeing workers in those sectors pioneer models like the model known as bargaining for the common good, which is a framework that tries to organize workers within, sort of traditional organizations of labor, within unions, but also be organizing members of the community that they're working with and serving, as a matter of both, both a sort of on principle and as a strategic point, right? Because you have to forge those connections so that you don't have that division of sort of pitting workers against the communities they're serving, where it looks like workers' gains come at the cost of, or we're going on strike, for example, seems like it will be at the cost of care for patients or for students or whoever it may be, but actually that you can see that workers and their organizations and their unions are in a stronger position when they are in conversation with communities and organizing around the needs that go together. And we've seen some, at least, I think, encouraging victories around that. Again, primarily in education, but we've also seen it some in care sectors as well. And so I think it's a really difficult challenge, but I think also one that can push us towards maybe some creative thinking about how and where labor organizing can extend beyond the workplace into broader community and social issues and build power and political movements more broadly. So yeah, a lot more to continue thinking about there.
Indeed, and thank you for addressing those themes so carefully and helpfully. The bargaining for the common good framing does very much seem to dovetail with the kind of coalition building that is at the center of the interconnected nature of the work that is put forward in this book. One of the questions asked of us is the question of backlash. Actually, if one really thinks about it, it's several of the issues that are raised in the book are issues that are the subject of real, in the questioner's words, neoliberal pushback. And I wonder if members of our authors team would like to turn your minds to where that leads us, right? What are the possibilities and limits? How does one move forward on this kind of deeply progressive agenda in the face of a moment like this one, really? As Julie mentioned at the outset, that this book is published by the same press as Friedman's work. Is the publication itself a form of anticipation and response to backlash? Maybe I'll turn back to you, Isabelle, for that, for engagement with that question.
Thank you so much, Adele. I guess this is our contribution at this point is to use our skills and our profession to make it relevant to society, and hopefully we can help equip citizens and society in general so that they can really feel that there are choices and that the future is actually what we will decide that we make out of it. So indeed, the road ahead is not going to be easy. As we mentioned, introducing the book, it is not the first time we are discussing these principles. They have been around for a long, long time. And so what I take as a sign of encouragement is that, again, we reach a point of crisis in our history where we find that we can advance together these principles, working together as academics and collaborating, researching these principles, and also researching these principles in collaboration with the actors who are putting them into practice. I saw in the responses mentions to the cooperatives. Obviously, this is clearly an actor who has been practicing democratizing work for as long as capitalism is alive. So we, by maybe like our contribution is by orienting our attention, society's attention, to helping nurture this debate, we can have a meaningful contribution in helping citizens and societies in general choose a different future, because this is the time. There will not be many opportunities like this in the future. So this is really the time to move ahead.
I like the tone of that, the time to move ahead. And that seems exactly where we should end. And before ending, I'll just underscore that several of the questions that we're not able to get to focus on how we move ahead and engage directly with the platform economy, as well as new social movements that Amazon and Starbucks are being raised in particular in the context as galvanizing democratic approaches to work. And certainly the initial reference, Isabel, that you made to the organizing at Amazon is very much in that spirit that much is unfolding in this moment. The depth of the precarity is cannot be overstated, frankly, but neither can the absolute insistence, and I think Alyssa said this well earlier, the absolute insistence of workers on ensuring that they organize, that they act in solidarity. It was Sarah, and move the democratization forward. And so let me end just by thanking each and every one for your engagement with our work, with this panel, renewed appreciation for the opening presentation and for our sterling set of speakers to these themes. This work continues, la luta continua, and the solidarity that is shown in this movement to democratize work is what will ultimately propel us forward and ensure that social justice as essential to peace remains our guiding light. So thank you to everyone who's here and celebrating this launch with us.
Thank you so much, Adele. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Let's keep in touch, and you find in the chat the link to the events that are coming up around the book on democratizingwork.org. Please go on the website and you will see the events that will take place now this summer, in the fall, and we look forward all the discussions we are going to have together. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Obrigada.